Chapter 14. There was a Greek who sang Italian songs. He thought it was Christmas if you asked him to sing. He sang for Dano Costello. He sang chiefly Come Back to Sorrento. That was Dano's favorite. Dano didn't put it in English. He put it flashily in the Italian, the way Chris Casamatis himself put it, in the way Chris said Torna Pechina and Il mio tesoro and vivere. Chris was a short, stout, big-hearted fellow of 28, with hair like wet tar and cream silk shirts, thick-limbed, fat and soft under the chin, and so pallid that he showed the blue-black beginnings of Friday's whiskers on Wednesday. Dano played him. He could go in there with his pals and ask Chris to stand them a feed until the horses or the dogs paid off. Chris was pleased to oblige. He wanted to be a concert artist. He never gave up thinking some impresario might hear him singing behind the counter or among the greasy dishes and whisk him away on a Cinderella ascension to all the realities that lived in his dreams. On those who liked his singing, Chris prayed for admiration and encouragement. He fostered them. He always remembered them in his moods of disappointment, and found them in his consolation. They believed in him. He much believed in himself. Dano had him taped, and Chris' weakness was Dano's strength. He sauntered into the billabong about 11 o'clock that morning, and put it on Chris for breakfast and a packet of fags. Fix you up Saturday. She's right, Dano. Hey, listen. Bet you don't know something. Me, I'm gonna sing on the amateur hour. You know the amateur hour? You don't tell me. Yeah, Chris giggled enthusiastically. 3 weeks' time, I got to do a lot of practice, Dano. Aw, scoffed Dano. You don't need practice. You'll romp home, and if you don't, he protected himself, the game's not square. How about that feed, Chris? I'm hollow. Okay, Chris said, darting along the counter into the kitchen and leaving the girl in charge. Dano looked her over, this thin as a banjo string, flat-chested, face like a wedge, up front in the key when they handed out the eyes, though. He hung his pork pie hat on a peg and sat down at the end of a cubicle and looked out into the street. The shoppers and the rush of traffic passing along Broadway. There was a prickling sweat along his hairline, and he wiped his brow carefully with a near-silk handkerchief. He sang out to Chris in the kitchen, "Haven't seen Puddin', Chris." Chris came to the curtained doorway. "Yeah, in here this morning, an hour ago maybe. Say anything about seeing me?" "Tonight," he said. Dano lit a cigarette, letting the smoke crawl out of his indolent mouth. He pulled his trouser legs up and crossed his legs and took a brief admiring look at the two-tone shoes and the brown socks and rested one elbow on the marble table and gazed out through the doorway. Chris came up with knife and fork and a cup and saucer and wiped his hands on his apron. He had that feller with him that bad egg. What bad egg? That Frankie Lauber. Geez, I don't want that feller in here, and I hope that Puddin' don't bring him here again. That bastard's just done time." "Yeah, I know the bloke you mean. Don't let him worry you, Chris." "No, but coming in here, he'll get the place a bad name. That low heel been in jail plenty times, and the police, they know him pretty well. I don't want no police poking in here. By geez, no. I could smell them eggs burning, Chris." Chris hurried off. In a few minutes, he was back with steak and eggs and bacon and onion gravy. He sat down opposite while Dano ate. Dano pushed the packet of cigarettes across to him, but Chris shook his head and tapped his throat and said, "Amateur hour." His clear, glossy skin held a radiance of excitement. I don't know yet what I sing on the amateur hour. He stroked his chin. I think maybe Toselli's Serenata, but everybody sings that. What about I sing Your Tiny Hand is Frozen, eh? Dano was wasting no time with the meal. There was plenty of butter with the compliments of Chris, and he slapped it on the bread. Yeah, I like that all right, but I like Come Back to Sorrento better. That's your masterpiece, Chris. You think? Beamed Chris. Well, sure. Not even that bloke on the record sings it as well as you do. What? That Tito Shipa that I play on the gramophone for you. Oh, geez. If I ever get a voice like that, I'd be a famous man. You kid a bloke, Dano. Listen, Dano said, I don't kid anybody. Straight from the shoulder, me. I'd soon tell you if you were up to you sing Come Back to Sorrento, and you'll walk away with the prize. I'm telling you. With intense pleasure working all over his mobile face, Chris Casamatis sat letting the pleasure go to town on his heart and imagination. And he stared with his soft, dark, nut-brown eyes at Dano's empty plate and announced, how's some ice cream go to top off? It'd go all right, Dano said. This one on the house. Chris told him generously, calling to the girl for the order. Dano pushed his plate away. He tapped a cigarette on the table, raised it to his lips, and glanced towards the door. And the cigarette dropped from his mouth, but he caught it in his hand, and he squeezed Hurley out of the cubicle and dashed to the front door and looked down the street, and rushed back and said, keep the ice cream on the Eskimo's nose, and whipped his hat off the peg, and was outside and walking quickly down the street. He saw her hurrying alone, and he wanted to get a look at her face. Same hair, all right, only longer to her shoulders. Bit taller, but maybe the high-heeled shoes did that. Slimmer, no, with the tallness maybe. She stopped at the curb, and he looked quickly in a window. Then he saw her cross the street, and watched her standing in the safety zone, waiting for the tram, and she was facing him, and he had no doubt. Her face was thinner, but it was her all right. He walked with the pedestrians across to the other side of the street and stood on the opposite curb behind her, and he was thinking, let her go, keep away from her, and he was thinking, a yap wouldn't hurt though. Get her and go over into University Park and have a mag and feel her out about things, and he thought she wouldn't want to know you. She'd kill you with a look and bolt, and he thought, oh, I don't know. She was always silly as a sunstruck duck. What can she do to you now? He had plenty of confidence. He was afraid of nothing. He could handle them all. A tram was at the stop, and she climbed in. He dashed past the traffic, across the road, and got in the back, and kept his eye on her hat, and the back of her head. The tram rolled on, and turned around, and took a leap, and swayed past the grimy houses and the yards, with washing blowing on the line, and he watched her hat and head at all the stops until she got out with the others. He scuttled off the wrong side and onto the curb and started to stroll back towards the city. He heard the tram clang away, and slowly he turned and saw her hurrying with a quick beat of her high-heeled shoes towards Westmoreland Street. He followed her, keeping his hat well down, and saw her turn into Wilbur Street, pause on the steps of a tenement, and take keys from her bag. She disappeared inside. He looked over the fence at the ragged little garden and went in and knocked. He rubbed the palms of his hands together and listened to the patter of feet in the hall. The door opened, and he stood there smiling. Hello, Cassie. Shock leaped to Cassie Dooley's face, and she seemed stunned, speechless. Dano took off his hat and put one foot on the threshold, and a hand on the door, and eased it back against her giving weight. And he was in the hall, and for a moment her eyes melted, then hardened, and her lips became firm with anger. What do you want here? Well, that's a nice way to greet an old friend, he smiled. He walked on down the hall, leaving her standing there. She shut the door and hurried after him. "How'd you know I lived here? Who told you?" "A cobber of mine. I don't know any cobbers of yours." "No?" Danny said archly. "No," she said, "and you can get out of here as quick as you like. Go on." Daniel looked hurt. "Geez, Cassie, I thought you'd be pleased to see me. I am to see you." "I'd be pleased to see you dead," she said furiously. "Ah, don't be like that, Cassie. It's not like you. You were always so sweet and gentle." "Wasn't I just?" She cut at him, her nostrils flaring slightly. His shoulders slumped, and he sat down on the small kitchen chair, slowly took his hat off and put it on the white scrubbed table, placed an elbow on his knee, and rested his forehead in his hand. I know, I didn't do the right thing," he said contritely. "I don't blame you for what you say. Go ahead and give me the words. I've got it coming." She looked at him, her chest rising with her anger and falling, and her breathing harder. She swallowed and wanted to cry for the emotion in her, for the memories that came together in him, for the stormy conjunction of what she felt for him once and what she felt for him now. And she watched him as he got up suddenly and went over to her, and she thought it was true remorse on his face. He put his arms around her, asking her to give him another chance, and she wanted to hold him as tightly and say how much she had wanted him at times through the long months, but she remembered the bitterness of those months, and she thrust him from her and told him to keep his hands off her. He heard the faintly false note in her voice, and he thought, "Keep working on her and she'll soften. Keep working." "All right," he said dejectedly. "I know when I'm not wanted." He picked up his hat off the table and turned on her. "You don't think it's been easy for me either, do you? What do you think I left home for? What do you think they kicked me out for? I went to the pack worrying about you, drank my head off." Her guard came down. "You mean you're away from your family?" "I know I let you down," he pursued, "but Cassie, you don't know the whole story. You don't know how I suffered for you, wondering all the time where you were and how you were doing. I didn't know where to find you." "No," she said meaningly. "Well, you ran off. You didn't try to get in touch with me, I noticed. What happened? Got another bloke, did you?" "Is that it?" "No, that's not it," she said quietly and emphatically. "What are you doing here in the city? What are you doing in this house? It's big enough to hold a family of 12. How come you're not with your people?" She saw what he intended her to see, the dark suspicion on his face, and she said, "My mother died, that's why I'm living here." "What about your old man?" "I wouldn't live with him, and he wouldn't live with me. It's 50-50. I'm working and supporting my child, and it suits me fine, and I don't want it any other way." Danny Costello looked calmly at her. "Where is the kid?" "With the sisters. They'll keep him till he's 3. Then I take him," she added cuttingly. "I'm the one that's saving now, and I'll make a better fist of it than you did." "I hope you do," he said, with self-pity and goodwill for her benefit. "As for the big house and the filthy thoughts in your mind about it, I was staying with a family in this house. They left, and I kept it on. You must be paying a swag in rent. Hovels come cheap, or am I telling you something? You'd look funny if I told you I came to ask you to marry me, wouldn't you?" "I'd look a sight funnier if I believed it, wouldn't I?" "Well, I did." He watched the expression on her face, truth and doubt that was teasing her mind. She didn't seem to know what to say. And he saw the old Cassie in her soft eyes and the new Cassie in her skeptical mouth. And he thought, she'll come round yet. Hell, this big house and only her in it. Yours and her to sleep with. Her to pay the rent and yours to sleep with. Say she must have a bit of Oscar saved up. 2. Pretty nice. Year since she had the kid. Pretty nice. He walked towards her, letting his eyes do the talking. "Take me back, Cassie. I want to be with you. I'm lost without you. I've always loved you, and I want you now." But that wasn't what she saw in his eyes, and if it was, she saw, in her new and hard-earned wisdom, what was behind it, and the sight of him sickened her. All the old and searing feelings came up in her mind, and the shocking burst of vision. How could he do this to me? How could any man you loved do this? How could any human being be so vile and inhuman? And all the hatred of the first dawn of her apocalypse came surging back, repeating spasmodically the torture and suffering it caused. And she felt faint with the grief of her disillusionment, and it was focused now in the unforgiving and implacable purpose in her face. When she spoke, her words were sharply articulated. You'll go now. You'll go, or I'll call the police." But Cassie, he was caught off balance. "Get out, will you?" she cried at him viciously. "Get out of my sight before I kill you." He lost control of himself. "What's the use of kidding with this brush? She's got it in for you, and you might be working on her for a year before she'd come good. And what's the use anyway?" "All right," he said, with a dull rage in his eyes, "but don't order me around like I was dirt under your feet. You slut, I ought to swipe you one. Marry you, I would be an Alec, a proper lemon." He strode down the hall, and she followed, and he swung out the door, and she said, "And don't ever come back here again," and slammed the door. He walked straight down the path, fitting his hat on his head with both hands, hot-faced and sneaking a glance to right and left at possible garps and eavesdroppers. And in the house, Cassidy knew she was right, had been right from the time she ran off and left him in the milk bar, with the terrible truth waking up in her shocked soul. But she fell on the bed and cried hysterically. Dano Costello met Chicker Foy, old Tenarce, always holding well, and he and Chicker went down to a house in Dixon Street, and the swy game was in full swing. The pennies went up, and the pennies came down in the center of the ring of men, and the men cheered, and some cursed, and the stakes vanished and were built again. And the air was hot and blue with smoke, and butts and matches littered the floor. The excitement welled up in Dano, and he did the 4 quid he had, and touched Chicker for a tenner, old Tenny, and played the tenor, and loosened his collar, and unbuttoned his coat, and watched the spinner, and the pennies spinning off the kip, and heard the yells, and listened to the ringy calling the results. The tenor brought him 20, and he went on betting on the side, and he had 50. He paid Chicker back, and plunged 15, spinning himself, and lost it, and risked a 5 and lost that, and hung on to the 20. Just like my luck to run out now. And there was Chicker, lucky cow, collecting from Tommy and Tipslinger, cleaning Tommy out, talk about Tenny. And that evening, about 7, feeling better, Dano and Chicker went up George Street to Railway Square and kept going. Chicker had an eye out for a piece he could spend his money on, but Dano said he'd think of the fluff later after he'd eaten. He'd pick up some juicy Judy hanging around Wynyard. Laughing, they rolled into Chris's and down to the end cubicle. Dano pulled out his roll and peeled off a quid and threw it to Chris and ordered 2 of the biggest steaks you've got, me boy, and take out what I owe you and keep the change. He sauntered back to the cubicle, peeping at the customers and catching the eyes of a big-eyed girl with long wavy blonde hair and winking largely at her while her boyfriend opposite hoed into his ice cream. When Dano sat down, Chicker walked down to the end of the bar calling to Chris that he was starving, and did Chris have anything to eat in the meantime. And Chris brought out a stick of celery, and Chicker, grinning all over his weak-chinned face, crunched and munched his way back to the cubicle. 4 men walked in, and one of them shot up to Dano and threw out his hand and said, "Dano, Button, you old polecat, where you been all the week? In here this morning, but missed you. I've had the stinking flu." He looked at Chicker and nodded, and Dano introduced them. "Got a few blokes I want you to meet, too," Puddin' Williams said, and slapped the man nearest him lightly on the back, a big man about 35 with a blocky face, black stubbled and a hat brim pulled down all around. "Dano, this is Frankie Lauber. I've told you about him." Dano put out his hand, smiling. "Glad to know you, Frankie. Puddin's always given you a rap." "How's things?" Lauber nodded, letting his hand be shaken. Puddin Williams, gingery Puddin Williams, in his leather lumber jacket and leather cap, enthusiastically ticked off the two men with Lauber. "And this is Hips McGuigan and Nap Tully." Nap and Hips nodded toughly, the vestige of a smile slipping on and slipping off their faces. Dano looked them over quickly. Couple of kid steaks, tough guys. Tough enough, maybe, but putting the rest of it on. He wouldn't care to find out just how tough that toughness was, though. "Squat the blot," Dano invited. Chris Casamatis looked out the kitchen and seemed worried. Puddin Williams caught his eye and beckoned him. Chris came to the table, hostile, and he said, without waiting for the orders, "Listen, you mister, maybe you all right, but I got to think of my business. I don't want you in here." Frankie Lauber looked up, and he looked at the Greek, and he said slowly, "You talking to me?" Chris swallowed, gestured, "Understand, no hard feelings a bit, but I got to mind my business, and I don't want no people like you in here because it gets a bad name for the place. No insult mentioned." "Listen, Dago," Frankie Lauber said in his edgy voice. "This place is open to the public, ain't it? You're here to serve everybody, ain't you? Well, I'm one of the public, and I'll come in here, and you'll serve me. And if I was you, I wouldn't give too much lip either." "Don't be a mug, Chris," Dano said. "Frankie's okay." Hips McGuigan, nearest to Chris, gave him a backhanded smack in the stomach, taking the Greek's wind for a few seconds, and told him to get going and bring the food. Chris's white face sweated as he wrote down the orders from Puddin Williams. He walked back to the kitchen, holding his stomach with one hand. "You'll be Jake when he gets to know you," Dano said. "He's a good scout, Chris. Doesn't mean anything." Lauber ignored his apology. He said, "They tell me you've got a bit of gray matter." "Who said that?" Dano laughed, flattered. Puddin Williams chipped in. "Picks the GGs like a whiz. Gets the good oil with that tongue of his. You oughter hear him. And tell Frankie the way he gets the sorts in." "I've been telling Frankie about you, Dano." Williams nodded pleasantly. "Spiel merchant, eh?" Dano laughed. "We might have a talk sometime." Lauber turned his face and fixed Dano with his bright, steely, long-lashed eyes. Dano drank in that look and was excited, even thrilled. "I'm in the boom. Plenty savvy, this bloke. Knows the ropes. Gets it easy. But wait a minute, don't jump like a fish at the first bright fly you see. Don't think he'd give me the bull. He might, though. Not giving a bloke the big talk, are you, Frankie? I mean, you can lay it on the line with me. I know you're a trump in your own way, so you don't have to impress me. I like my talk straight from the shoulder." He felt a trifle nervous as Lauber turned and stared him straight in the eye, a little surprise on his hard-bitten face. "That's the way I give it," he said. Dano broke into a laugh, sensing the slight tension. "Well, that's fine, Frankie. Put it there." And he grabbed Lauber's casually proffered hand and shook it, and Puddin Williams had something to say. So did Chickerfoy, and the tension was gone. Chris came with the food, and he looked at none of them, but they all knew for whom the surly grimace on his face was meant. "What's it like on the inside, Frankie?" Dano asked, interested. "Those bloody warders put the boot in, like I hear. It's a holiday," Lauber told him. "I been in every stir in this country, bar a few not worth mentioning, and I wouldn't have 'em change 'em. It's an education." Dano, Chicker, and Puddin Williams laughed. "Listen," Lauber said, "I learned all I know in jail, and every time I lob there, I learn more. It's just like going to school and being taught by the best teachers, only you'd never find all the best teachers in one school like you find 'em in the jug." "What's your plans now, Frankie?" Dano asked. When I get the dough, Frankie Lobber said, I'm going for a baccarat school. That's where the coin is. And the suckers. You boys ever been to Kitty Cheeseman's joint? Ever been to Harry the Gentleman's? Pudden and Chicker said they had never heard of them. Dano kept his ignorance back, nodded knowingly, and said, No, but I've heard plenty about them. It's an eye-opener, Lobber told them. Bankers and bookies told to the nines, and their dames. Get a whiff of 'em. That whiff comes out of a small bottle worth 50 quid. Stand them on their heads, and the hooted roll everywhere. Horse trainers, quacks, old rams with bits of fluff, and they are all lousy with dough. Geez, I'd like to go along there, Dano thought excitedly, but he let the words come out casually. Wouldn't mind having a bo-peep at that. Kitty opens the joint 4 times a week, from 9 at night till 5 in the morning. What about tomorrow night? I'll be in that, Dano told him. What about me? Chicker Foy asked, grinning. Sounds right up my alley, with the lucky streak I got. Lobber glanced unconcernedly at him, and Chicker knew he wasn't on the inner circle of the great man. The great man gave his sober attention to Dano and said, Meet me here at 8:30. But listen, Frankie, one other thing. These people throw the bets high, don't they? You can get a card for a quid, Lobber said. You can win 500 in 5 minutes, less, and you can lose it in 40 seconds. If you're hard up for chips, don't worry. The touches at Kitty's are good, so long as you're with me. All right, tomorrow night. You got to go yet? Pudden Williams asked. I got business, Lobber said. You won't be tagging along. Stay here. Oh yeah, I was, Pudden said, disappointed at the rough snub. The great man got up, and the 2 little great men got up, and they edged out on to the floor. Chris came down opposite them behind the counter and watched them with no humor on his face. Lobber dawdled up and asked him how much, and Chris said the same as was on the check he gave them. And Lobber looked at Chris, and Lobber's head was slightly bent, and his eyes were turned up, and fear came in Chris Casamata's belly. But he held the expression on his face. Hey, Frankie, Dano called. Don't worry about that. It's on me. Lobber turned and looked soberly at Dano. Consider yourself my guest, Dano gestured with a flourish of companionable generosity. Lobber nodded and sauntered out, and his benchman sauntered with him. Struth, Dano, Pudden Williams said. He didn't half take a fancy to you, did he? I'll say he did, Chicker said. Get the cold shoulder he gave me. Tough-looking sod, ain't he? He's tough all right, Pudden Williams said. I wouldn't like to tangle with him. Where do you reckon he's gone? Dano asked. Off a job somewhere, could be. He only got out yester. But he don't waste time. Or maybe he's gone to beat some bludger up. Or do some Sheila. God pity the Sheila, Chicker Foy laughed. 6 months he did in the boob, didn't he? 9, Pudden said. 9, shrieked Chicker Foy in a whisper. 9 months, holy hell. Not for me, brother, not for me. And, hey, listen, that reminds me, if we're gonna do any good for ourselves, we'd better get moving, Dano. Dano looked at Chicker and then at Pudden. Chicker was well dressed. He was all right, but Pudden was warby. Better find out what he's doing. Don't want him stringing along like that. Cramp your style from the start. He said, you should have togged up, Pudden, and you could have done a strut with us. That won't worry me, Pudden laughed easily. I'll do all right. Let's go. No, but it'll worry me, Dano said. Pudden looked like a sulky ginger bear. Strike a light, Dano. You gimme the Jimmy Brits at times. If you wasn't my mate, I'd knock you tall over tip for saying that. No, you wouldn't, Dano said, because I wouldn't let you. He patted Pudden's leather shoulder. Don't be a more pork, Button. There's no one can touch you when you're all cleaned up. Go home and get dressed, and we'll pick you up somewhere. Go on, buzz off, Button said, savoring the sop to his vanity and letting the insult to theirs fizzle out. He sat down and told Chris to bring him an ice cream. Dano pulled his hat smartly on his head and jubilantly waltzed over to the counter, opened his mouth on an angle, and sang the two words, Figaro, Figaro. And that was enough for Chris Casamadas. His head shot back, his eyes sparkled, his mouth opened like a pickle jar, his neck puffed, and he gave voice, Fiago aqua, Fiago la, Figaro su Figaro giu. And he went on, Figaro bravissimo, while Dano gestured in a pantomime of beating time. And then he burst into laughter, and Chris stood back beaming and his chest swelling, and he said, Good, eh? Magnifique song, cried Dano, with an affected air, and laughed, See you tomorrow, Chris. She's right, Dano, and Chicker went out laughing. Feel like a real fling tonight, Dano said. How about we grab a couple of Janes and go to Bluey's? How much you got? Plenty, Chicker said. Come on, let's go. They took a tram down to Wynyard and went on the hunt and took their pick from the malls, amateurs, and good time girls on the hunt there. And they went to Bluey's hot spot in a taxi, and the girls giggled in the taxi and said, Stop it. And they drank and watched the floor show, the nearly naked girls doing belly dances, and the strip teaser peeling off in slow motion. And they laughed at the comedians with their hoocha stories, and it got good and bright. The drink flowed, and the band whizzed up, and a mob of youths fell into a circle, and in the circle one of the girls was doing better than the stripteaser, and there was plenty of laughter and gaiety and dancing, and the young girl fell back in Dano's lap, stripped to the waist, and he closed his hands over her breast, and he breathed in her ear. What would Mama say if she saw you now? And he squeezed her and kneed her up into the arms of her half-rinsed partner with a laugh, and Chicker said to a waiter, What about it? And winked, and the waiter brought Chicker a packet of reefers, and Chicker handed them around, winking at Dano, and they watched the two girls smoking, and they waited for the signs and the signs in themselves. And Dano said, That's what I like about this place, they sell you reefers. And Chicker laughed and said, And boy, what I like about reefers. Dano and his girl sat in front of the table, and behind them under the table on the floor. Chickerfoy had his girl, and the busybodies came around pointing and laughing. And Dano told them to go to hell, and he picked up a bottle, and they laughed and went. And then it was his turn. The lights were dimming to a sepia duskiness, and others were doing it. The lights went down more, and Chicker guffed and said, That's what I like about this place, too. They give you a run for your money. And Dano said, Yeah, not like some. And the morning was still a long way off, and it was the time when all nice parents should be at home in bed, and they were.